absolutely. And there Shivan. Your mic is on.
Yeah. Hi everyone, can you hear me? Can you hear us at the back?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Let me start by saying that this session was to have been moderated by someone called Ian Jack. That's not me. I'm not Ian Jack. I'm not the same color. I'm not the same gender. I'm not from the same country. I'm not even the same height, which is the one thing that I feel sorry about. It'd be great to have a little more, a few more inches, but that's not me.
Not the same weight either, Rishi, so you'd be fine.
Not the same weight either. So, and this is Ian Jack. What we're going to be doing is talking about the journal Granta, which I think pretty much all of you know, the issue on India, which I have here and which is in the bookshops, is an issue that's been guest edited by Ian, and we are lucky to have three of the writers who are in that issue here with us. Deepti Kapoor, who you know well as a novelist, whose recent novel, A Bad Character, has been a major success. Sam Miller, who is a journalist who's stayed on in India for many, many years and who's written a book on Delhi recently, which has also been a major success. Raghu, one-time editor of a wonderful magazine called Time Out, and now turned writer who's in the process of completing a non-fiction book on a family history related to the Second World War. So we're going to be talking to the writers. I just want to say I'm particularly grateful to Deepti for being here. She's not feeling very well, and we have kind of bullied her into coming up here because we didn't want the panel without her.
Thank you.
But Deepti may slide away in the middle if she doesn't feel too good. So do please forgive her for that. I'm going to start by asking Ian, who for many years, how many, 12 or 17?
12.
For 12 years was editor of Granta. And then, of course, he left, and then he was called back to edit the second issue that the journal has done on India. The first one was in 1997 to mark the 50th anniversary of India's independence. And the second one is now, and there is a huge time gap and a huge difference between those two moments when Granta was trying to in some way reflect and represent what was happening in Indian writing at that time, what's happening now. So Ian, I'm going to ask you to start by telling us a little about what you see as the difference between that moment in 1997 when you put that issue together and now, and the kinds of writing that you have included in this current issue.
Fine. Can you hear me okay? That's the first question, because I've got quite a soft voice, thanks to training in a Scottish primary school. I just want to, before I answer Urvishi's question, I should tell you something about Granta, because it's an interesting history. Granta's the Latin or Roman name for the River Cam in Cambridge. It began Life Granta magazine as a student magazine in 1889. All kinds of unexpected people wrote for it. A. Milne, who did Winnie the Pooh, wrote for it, in fact edited it, and said he wanted on his gravestone the words, "I was a Granta man." Ted Hughes wrote for it, E.M. Foster wrote for it, and it began as a student magazine. It carried on until about 1979 as a student magazine, and then it gradually collapsed. And then three American postgrad students bought its title from King's College for £1 and launched it as the magazine, pretty well as the magazine it now is. And it was done as a book, as a paperback book, which is a good thing to have done. And it was originally intended to be a magazine about writing, which, thank God, it never became. Very quickly, it became a magazine that never published writing about writing. It never published poetry. on the grounds, as Bill, my predecessor as editor, used to say, he didn't mind poetry, it was the poets he couldn't stand. And, and what it did, and I'm coming on to the nub of Urvishi's question, what it did, it wasn't the only thing to do this, of course, but in the 1980s, it expanded the idea of what literature was. A literary magazine, until that time, published poetry, it might publish literary essays, it published stories, it might publish a bit of a novel, it might publish a play. But what it didn't usually publish was bits of memoir, that thing called reportage, which is just a fancy French word for reporting, memoir, travel. These aspects of the kind of non-fiction genre, it did not publish. Literary magazines tended not to publish anyway. And Granta took all these things and made them part of its canon, if you like. And that turned out to be a rather brilliant thing to have done, because it increased its audience, and a person picking up Granta would see a subject rather than a literary form. So there are some people interested in India who are not interested in short stories, and vice versa. But more people are interested in concrete things than abstract ones. And that was a great trick to have pulled off. Before my time, I'm not taking any credit for that. And I began to write for it then I became editor in 1995. And it became, I mean, rather astonishingly, again, I'm blowing a trumpet that isn't mine, it became the world's most successful literary magazine. At its height, I would say in the late 80s, early 90s, it was selling about 100,000 copies every issue, which is an amazing thing to have done. Now, when we come to 1997, I had this idea we needed to do India partly because of interesting writing coming out of India, but partly because of a political reason, which was the 50th anniversary. And in terms of what was in it, we were very lucky we got a bit of Arundhati Roy's novel, which hadn't been published at that point. We got a story from Anita Desai and other things that you would expect. But rather unexpectedly, we had a wonderful piece from my friend on my left here, Urvashi, about her uncle in Lahore and about partition. And we got a piece from a man called Suketa Mehta on Bombay. And the rest of the non-fiction in that issue tended to be written by white people like myself from Britain. J.B. Buchan on Kashmir is an example. And at that point, and this is something we'll talk about, India tended to be described in literary ways by people who didn't live here. And that looks rather astonishing now, but it was the case. When I came to India, the books that I had as my guides were E.M. Forster, even poor old Rudyard Kipling, Naipaul, and Ved Mehta. Mehta certainly had been born here, but he didn't live here. So it was very much a kind of outsider's view of India, I guess, but it was the view that one took with one when one came here. And I think the big change between then and now is that kind of, for lack of a better phrase, literary non-fiction, well-written non-fiction, non-fiction with a kind of literary ambition, is much more common from Indian writers now than it was those years ago. And that, I hope, is what we've managed to do with this new issue on India.
Thank you, Ian. If any of you can't hear at the back, please start waving your hands so that then I can tell the speakers to speak louder. So, Ian, you've talked about the two crucial things that you've talked about, and I'm going to ask you to comment on this. Ian has said that one of the changes that has come about between 1997 and now is the expansion of the idea of what is literature. So taking in many more forms of writing, which is what Granta has tried to reflect. And the other thing that you've talked about is that India was written at that time largely by white people who did not live here, white men.
Yeah,
Four writers you named were all men, hardly any women. And that also seems to have changed a great deal. All the three writers here actually are located within India, although location is not necessarily the key thing. Deepti, do you want to comment a little on those? Do you think those changes that Ian has talked about are the sorts of changes that have happened for you as a writer? You know, what has been the most enabling thing, and also what has it meant to be published in Granta?
Well,
It's worth pointing out that Deepti is actually a former editor of a magazine, so you've seen it from the commissioning side as well, right?
yeah, but also because I think being in a Granta just means, especially as a young writer today, it gives you seriousness and respectability, which, you know, even publishing your own book doesn't. And there's certain also, I mean, it's what, 18 years since the last Granta came out, and in a way there's the fact that you're apparently speaking for India, which is, I think there's a certain sense of tension, because I don't know if I'm speaking for India. It's a hard one to say. And Ian has just spoken about non-fiction, whereas my story in this issue is fiction. But at the same time, I understand why non-fiction is the form that a lot of young Indian writers are now using. Well, first, of course, there's a certain, you can bring yourself in. Styles have changed. It's much more creative. You can explore a lot more in nonfiction than you could earlier, or that you were even taught to. It's not dry facts anymore. But Sam does it really well. He brings himself in all the time. I just actually did write something, I'm not sure it'll be coming out, a non-fictional piece based around my fiction piece, which was loads of fun because I went and spoke. It was set in Greater Noida, which is this very strange, bizarre place where my mother has moved to. And it's these luxury townships which are sitting in the middle of wasteland. There's a lot of crime. And we just, I went with my mother's driver, who's an original, he's a farmer from the area, to his village. And we drove around, talked to people, and that was actually much more exciting to me than actually sitting in a room and writing a story or making up something. So, yeah, and also fiction does come mostly from non-fiction, so that was fun. Yes, yeah. So that's, I mean, my story did come from watching stuff happen.
Things around you.
Yeah.
But the question that, the comment that Raghu made, that you have also been an editor of a magazine and you have commissioned stories and you have been at the receiving end of what people write and send in unsolicited, wanting to be published. So what's been your experience of that? Is there a variety in what you get, or is there a sameness?
Well, I was unfortunately, or fortunately, I was made the editor of a men's magazine, and I tried to make it a literary magazine, or at least film and culture, and eventually got myself fired. So this is what I used to try and commission pieces on you know, cinema in the 70s, I remember, and Raghu, and, you know, maybe I did essays on masculinity, and they were like, let's do something on lingerie and watches. And then when I ended up objectifying women a lot, I eventually left because it didn't work. It was not a right fit. But yes, it's interesting what you get and how you choose what you're going to put forth, and also how you eventually end up. There's also the publishers and what they want. So I don't know if Ian has that as well, or he's completely in control. Yeah.
No, I never had much of that.
Yeah,
no,
okay.
No.
You haven't had much of what?
I haven't had much proprietorial interference in my time. I had a very good proprietor for the years I edited Granta, who actually was almost negligent in his lack of concern of what I was putting in, really. Mm-hmm. He seemed entirely happy, and he was a very nice man. He also published the New York Review of Books. So no, I haven't had that very much. I think this isn't what we're here to talk about, but I think the worst aspect of editing Granta, which is a kind of dream job, really. I mean, what's not to like about it? But the worst thing is commissioning things that don't work and then rejecting them. That is the most terrible thing you have to do, I think. Because somebody spent months and months on this, and you get it, and you say, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. You might try editing it into making it work, but sometimes not even that. Then you have to tell them it hasn't worked. And sometimes you can't even pay them. Let's not go there.
Let's not go there. That is an occupational hazard. Sam, what's your comment on, do you see much change? You've been living in India a long time. You've been reading stuff by Indian writers. Do you see a lot of change in the kinds of things that get written about? Do you see more variety?
Yeah, I mean, I've been here on and off for pretty well 25 years, and I think over that period I've seen enormous changes. I think you see it first in fiction and then in non-fiction. And what's interesting for me is how over the last 10 or 12 years we've really seen a mushrooming of really talented non-fiction writing and writers. This isn't universally true, but a lot of it has come out of journalism, of people who are journalists who maybe started in journalism in the early to mid-90s when we had this boom in journalism, a fundamental change in the nature of journalism in India, which drew in creative people who wanted to write and who would often feel quite constrained. They would still have some ability to write, and that's got better over the years with certain magazines that have done a very good job of that. If you think about Caravan magazine, Motherland, various others that have really taken the business, Indian Quarterly now, have taken the business of writing and writing non-fiction seriously. There are many, many more opportunities for them. And it feels like it's come of age. There are two pieces, a piece by Raghu and a piece by Samanth Subramaniam in this Granta, which I recommend to everyone. I think they're exceptional examples of really good non-fiction writing by Indians about India. One historical, one current, but they belong very much together, and they belong among the best of modern non-fiction writing, in my view, anywhere.
But you rightly pointed to journalism and the expansion and explosion of journalism in India because, I guess, of the increase in the number of magazines and also in television, news channels and so on. So you've pointed to that leading to writing, but in my experience as a publisher, the gap between a 1,200-word piece and the skills that requires and writing a long essay of 5,000, most journalists don't know how to do that.
And most journalists will never do it, in fact, and a lot of them don't want to. They don't want to write something of that length. They prefer to be following the daily stories, and still in most media organizations, the highest status job is the one that's the day's breaking news, the politics. The feature writers are often the people who, hey, what do they do? And they're never in the office. They're out chasing stories if their editors give them time, which is rare. So, yeah, the vast number of them won't do it. And we also know that there are some people who can't make that transition. They would love to, but it is a very different form. For me, personally, my writing is very much an extension of my journalism. But I think some of my earliest journalism was sort of 2,000 or 3,000 word long. So it's in a way I've always wanted to write at greater length. So I think some people can make that transition, and some people really don't want to. In a way, they're still going to have more readers and more influence on the front page of the top-selling newspaper or TV channel in the country than they are through their book. And it's still, certainly for me, my writing is a personal thing. It's something I want to do more than it being a job or a means to convert thousands of people to my way of thinking about anything. It's just what I want to do, and if people are interested and want to engage with me on it, then that's just a wonderful extra feeling.
Yeah, and it's not only about numbers, I guess, because you can, of course, reach more numbers with broadcast and television, but it's about the permanence and the long-lastingness of the print medium still. Raghu, what's your comment on whether and how things have changed, if at all? What influence journalism has had?
Well,
you've been a journalist too.
Yeah,
right?
I should start off by saying this is quite difficult because I feel like a bit of an imposter. It's still sinking in that I'm sitting on a stage talking about Granta, because all my life Granta has entirely seemed like it belonged to, like, the writers and it belonged to a different sphere of accomplishment and nobility and all of this. And I probably shouldn't even admit this because it's just going to make me look even drive me even further into disgrace. But there was, if people who are on Facebook may remember that there was a meme going around earlier this year about the 10 books that had the greatest impact on your life. And I was very aloof from this for a while, and was not going to like reduce myself to admitting that there were only, that it was possible to limit myself to 10 books. But it actually began to get interesting, and I began to be very moved by my friends' list. So I took a photograph of the 10 books, which I did still have on my bookshelves. One of them was the Granta book of reportage, which, as it happens, was edited by Ian, I think.
Yeah.
So Granta has always been vastly impressive for me, and this particular book was a piece of my education, a piece of my journalistic education, and even it was in fact very inspiring. I first read Kapuscinski in that volume. It has this amazing, it's absolutely worth buying. It's superb journalism, it's the best in the world. It has this piece by Marilyn Robinson about a nuclear power plant, which I still think is a model of a particular kind of awareness-raising writing. Yeah, what is the question I was going to be talking about? About the nonfiction. Well, it's a little bit dreary to bring these two factors in as an explanation for anything at this point. But I do, although I don't want to fall into a trap of some kind of generational exceptionalism, I do think that the way the economy changed in the 1990s, as Sam said, and the way the internet arrived and changed what we were reading has really transformed the quality and maybe the vitality of some of the non-fiction journalism here. It felt palpable to me that by the turn of this last century, there was the economy was supporting was supporting several publications that it might not have done. Maybe a little bit earlier, there would have just been sort of I don't know, Debonair or something like that. You had to find small niches and smaller in various magazines. But suddenly, Deepti and I met in 2004 or 5.
Yeah.
And those opening issues of The Man before she was fired were amazing. I was a big admirer, and they were really cool and helped get me through my job at that point, which was writing about watches and handbags. And yeah, but certainly I think the Helka deserves a lot of credit for tiding a lot of young writers through that period, and for being open to a degree of stylization and of literary input into even reporting, which was very significant. I think tons of people went through the Helka. If I can make a small plug for myself, it may be surprising, but or not for myself, but rather for my boss who's here. His name is Naresh. My former boss, Naresh Fernandez, used to be the editor-in-chief of Time Out magazine. And it may seem unlikely, but in fact, Time Out primed a lot of younger writers who are now, I think, some of the best in our age group, many of whom are now attendees and published authors at this festival. So anyway, that's the economic angle. Obviously, the internet also arrived, and I think it suddenly made a whole sort of deluge of global quality, top flight writing available to us as readers. And I don't know if that would have been true 10 years prior, maybe even in the 80s. Obviously, a lot of it would have been published, but it wouldn't have been as accessible. I mean, in the 70s, we didn't even have Penguin India, right? So obviously things have been changing very fast.
Wasn't such a bad thing.
The internet?
No.
Well, it's bad for writing, but it does mean that you can, what?
No, it's okay, carry on.
No, I mean, there are obviously downsides to all of these things, but I'm just describing what was this palpable sort of contribution they made. And suddenly, like you can come out of college and what you in small town India, and you can have been reading David Foster Wallace if that encounter happens. It's at least possible, and I think that really did sort of vivify a lot of people's writing.
Just, did you want to add something, Ian?
Well, I was just going to come back to the thought of India and its place as a culture that made very unsuccessful nonfiction, really, as far as I was concerned. I mean, when I came here first in 1976, the great book that every Anglophone Indian had on their shelves or was reading was a thing called Freedom at Midnight, written by Dominic Lapierre and Larry Collins. And they were absolutely foreign to India. They had believed everything Mountbatten told them very gullibly, but it was a hugely successful book. Whereas if you went, and I mean, I was a normally curious person, I was interested in Indian history, I didn't know much about it. But if you were interested in the particulars of India and reading descriptions of them, you might go to OUP in Daryaganj in Delhi and the office there, and you might pick up a book. And I was quite interested in Victorian India, in 19th century India, in railways and steam engines and things. And you might pick up a book and it might see the Indian railway strikes of the 19th century. And the first 2 pages would be very interesting, and the footnotes would be interesting throughout. But the bulk of the book would turn out to be somebody's PhD thesis. So everything was seen through a kind of prism. That particular prism would be called subaltern studies. But the kind of interestingness of the subject would be obscured by the theory attached to the subject. And I think that's something that's changed utterly in India now. There are people writing books here because the subject is interesting without any kind of political framework around the subject. And that's a kind of British or American thing with nonfiction. But it's interesting that it took a while to happen in India, I think.
Yeah, I think that leads me to the question that I was about to put, and this is for all of you, all three of you, and pretty much all the writers in this particular issue of Granta are writing India. You know, it's like, so when you put together an issue of a journal about India, the problem is it Indian writers? Is it people who write India? How can you write India? And when Raghu made a reference to the way in which the economy has opened India up to the world and opened the world up to India, and the way in which the internet has also done that, the expectation might be that you might have a whole lot of Indian writers writing the world in the way that, say, writers from England wrote India and wrote other places, or in the way that that the foreign writer wrote other cultures, with a confidence and a sense of the rightness of it, if you like. I'm quite curious about why is it that Indian writers do not step outside that mold that much. A few of them do. Is it that India is endlessly fascinating? Is it that there's a particular burden being in an issue of Granta called India, that you have to write India, or what is it? Any of you?
Well, I think India is extremely fascinating, and there's a lot of writers who say...
Pick that up a
yeah.
bit.
I was told by someone, don't move to New York like all the other Indian writers. You know, India is Dickensian. It's got so much going on. There's lots of issues. It's bizarre. You find stories everywhere. I don't know if I could do that if I moved to Europe, where, you know, maybe it's more comfortable to live, but, you know, it might not be so enriching. I don't know, Raghu, what do you think?
I think I don't know. I think writing India as a phrase is something that we can sort of examine closely. I think certainly what's been happening, in my view of the recent trend in writing, is that people are choosing or realizing that you can't write India whatsoever. You can certainly write the sort of book that a foreign correspondent produces at the end of a 10-year sort of tenure here, which explains everything. But I found that those are really the least inspiring of the nonfiction that Indians are writing, and happily I think many people are swerving away from that. I find that perhaps what may be, if it's true that Indian nonfiction is improving and is suddenly found a new sort of source of energy, then maybe part of that source of energy is realizing that we don't need to write sort of comprehensive and overarching theses on India, and that you don't have to be Neeraj Chaudhuri or anyone in that mold, but that the individual stories and the sort of the granular stuff is what makes for the best writing. I think that certainly comes out in the volume, and it comes out in the best non-fiction that I've been reading written by Indians.
Sam, you have a comment on that? I mean,
I'm in a way, both an insider and an outsider here. I'm not Indian. I don't go around claiming to be Indian, even though I've lived here for many, many years now. I also don't feel terribly British, which is where I come from. I like subjects that work for me because I'm an insider and an outsider. So I think there have been some perfectly good examples of these foreign correspondence books for the rest of the world, but it's certainly not what I'm interested in doing. I think it's much more interesting to examine things that almost relate to this where do you belong to question. And one of the I wrote about Gandhi in this edition of Granta, and Gandhi in London. Gandhi spends 2.5 years there in the late 1880s. And in a way, what it is, his writings about it are a non-fiction memoir account of London in that period. And they're a remarkable read, and they're often forgotten. But they're almost, what we're talking about has been done before, just not often in the form that we expect to see it. I'm delighted that there are so many Indians in this volume, and it's quite nice in a sort of slightly vicarious way for me to be there as well. But I'm nervous in some ways on behalf, and I know fellow foreigners suddenly feel nervous as if they can't write on India anymore, that only Indians can do it. And I will say back to them that in a way they've got to find a subject that suits them, rather than just think they can get away with conveying India to the world as if it's the truth. And I think some of them did used to do that. And I think there are other ways of doing things like that, which don't have to be authoritative, this is India today.
But
Yeah,
you yourself...
If I can just jump in and sort of retract what I just said and give reassurance to anyone who might be feeling that way, I do still think that, to be very blunt, some of the best writing and some of the frontiers are still being broken by writers who are based here who are not Indian. And I think, this could be a whole seminar on its own, but I think Catherine Boo's book is a very good example of how the kind of physical courage that is involved in spending enough time in a slum, irrespective of what you sort of think about the kind of epistemological questions that and her methodology, that you spend enough time in a slum and you produce an absolutely gripping and empathetic and eye-opening story. That is still being done. Some of that stuff is still being done by foreign journalists who work for newspapers and publications that set the world standard, which we don't have the equivalent of here. But we're learning, and that interaction is part of what's most interesting at this point, I think.
I mean, somewhere at the bottom of what you're saying lies the question that troubles all such writing, which is who gets to represent whom. Yeah. You know, who can write about what, about whom. And you said yesterday, Sam, when we were talking, that there are certain aspects of India that you would be somewhat hesitant to write about, and you would think, no, that's not for me, that's for an Indian writer. It'd be great if you spoke a little more about that. But also, I want to ask Raghu and Deepti, and I want to ask you, Ian, the writers you have in the Granta issue on India are by and large writers who write in English.
Yes.
You've got very few translations,
Yes.
and there is also a somewhat smaller number of women.
Probably.
She said.
Probably.
Now,
He said defensively.
okay, so no, but the thing is that as an editor, there is you know that there is a whole tradition, and there are multiple traditions of writing in many Indian languages. So the choice and how you access those languages is something that it might be interesting to talk about.
Okay.
But for Raghu and Deepti, whether you intended it or not, and obviously you didn't intend it, but you, by being in that journal, you get to represent India in a way that that others who are absent, I mean, you get to speak for their absences, if you like, which is not a burden you might or might not have chosen. But what would you feel about it, Do you see that as a burden at all, or is it something that you don't think about?
Well, I'm thinking about it only. I'm thinking about it only now. When you actually start to write, you're just hoping that your submission will be accepted, And then when it's actually there and it comes out, and then you realize that this is not going to say, and there won't be another one for another decade or whatever, and then I don't know. I mean, it's a burden because you don't want. I mean, at one level, you understand that this is this is what people are going to read about India, but at another level, you don't necessarily want to be. I mean, especially for me as a fiction writer, sometimes I don't want to be the voice of India. But I mean, Raghu, what do you feel about this?
Well, I should, so that this makes sense, my essay is about as esoteric a subject as anyone could conceivably find to write about in the Granta on India. It's about, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's about a ghost, a Japanese internment camp, and the old fort, the old Mughal fort that's also called Purana Killa in New Delhi.
Sounds completely Indian to me.
In certain, yeah. And
you carry on.
no.
No, I was just going to say, I was worried about this. It's almost as if we're expecting this to be an exercise in nation building.
That's
and
the
it,
thing.
and it isn't. It's an example to showcase some great writing that's associated with India. In a way, I don't like sort of trying to convert people, but we've all got to kind of get over this nation building phase where everything that is about India is somehow representing India, that's showing off India to the world, as if it's a festival of India traveling around the world in the 1950s. I think we've got beyond that here, and that what we're really talking about is some great writing that's about and by Indians. It's not trying to sum up India. And your piece being so esoteric and wonderful makes that point, because it's about the I can never say that word, specificity of the stories, rather than them being stories that try and encapsulate somewhere as so huge and different and vast as India. This doesn't encapsulate India, but it gives you lots of ideas about particular Indias. And I think that's its value rather than nation building.
I mean, Urvashi asked Deepti about the burden of appearing in Granta. Well, it'd be horrible to think it was a kind of lifelong burden. We do something called the Best of Young British Novelists every 10 years, and in which we select, I say we, I'm no longer associated with the magazine in that sense, but Granta used to select, 20 promising novelists under 40. It became a big thing, and it was important to appear on the list. And I remember Louis de Bernay, who wrote a book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin, it's an immensely popular novel, and he was awarded this accolade of being one of Granta's 20 young best of British novelists. And he said, for the next year, he said, trying to write was like standing naked on a plinth in Trafalgar Square, trying to have an erection. Now, that seems to me going too far in terms of burden. In terms of representing India, I mean, what Sam said is absolutely correct. I mean, one can't do it, one shouldn't even try. I'm aware, though, of something that Urvashi mentioned, which is always mentioned at these occasions, which is the lack of translation from Indian languages other than English into English. And what can I say? I think translation requires such commitment from the translator to make the translation really good. And because translation is not very well paid, and people don't take enough time over it probably, you're lucky to get good translations in India. It's really difficult, that. Yes, there aren't enough women in the issue probably, but I did an issue on Australia maybe in the 1990s, and there wasn't an Aboriginal writer in the issue. And I couldn't find an Aboriginal writer, or at least I couldn't find one whose writing I liked. And that's a different kind of burden on the editor rather than the writer. You cannot put anthologies together that represent the kind of sociological makeup of a country. It's just complete waste of time. I mean, there aren't enough women. Some women some women, I say, not you, Rishi, in London made this point to me, so we had to crank up the kind of women rate. But I said to her, I said, but you know, there aren't any Dalits in the issue. I mean, we can look at India through various social prisms, and we'll never get it right. And we should just really try and concentrate on publishing good, interesting writing about India as far as we can.
Yes, I think that's the kind of statement that needs. Raghu, you didn't finish what you were saying. Sam interrupted you.
Where were we on that?
About the burden of representing and whether India can be encapsulated.
Right, I think actually Sam took it in exactly the right direction, and thank you for being so kind about the piece. I do think that in fact, the fact that I think in fact this volume might characterize a point in which we are no longer concerned about a nation building project or about constituting something. I think perhaps that gap may even be visible to some extent between the earlier Granta and this one. I'm not entirely sure, but the interest in the odd, in the specific, in the eccentric, which actually does make up the history and constitutes India as much as whatever can be seen as being, you know, sort of representative or integral or major. I think that's actually probably very, very fruitful for writing. Sam's sort of an expert, not to trade, you know, compliments or anything, but all of Sam's books are absolutely hilarious, and they're expert at walking through places and finding oddity and curiosities that somehow come together and manage to constitute the larger picture perfectly well, but while completely avoiding what would otherwise be cliches and sort of known tracks through either history or the country. Yeah. So I actually think that that doesn't feel like a concern. I would definitely. I mean, I think that it's important that there is writing that gets published by Dalits and that writing is representative, that publishing is representative. I'm not in a position to advance that myself. So we were speaking about magazines that have and in publications in the press that have contributed to the nonfiction to the rise in nonfiction. I think Caravan's done an amazing job with that in its fiction, and Caravan has taken a step that's really exemplary. They actually have a position on staff that's reserved for someone who's either a Dalit or a member of a scheduled tribe. You know, you could call that sort of identity politics, but I think that it's just a case of someone having the courage to invest in you know, to put their money where their mouth is. And I think Caravan, lots of writing in Caravan sort of confirms this principle. So it's good, but perhaps not for Granta, I don't think. No.
Yeah, well, yes.
I just want to say something about the sense of audience, not this audience, but when you're writing, it's difficult knowing who you're writing for, and I feel a lot of Indian writing from India until the last 20 years or so had this kind of audience problem in mind, that, you know, if you, as Amitabh Kumar has written, if you included the word samosa, you had to just say to people what a samosa was, because the publisher in New York or London would ask. And I was also guilty of that as an editor, I have to say. I remember getting a piece from Amit Chaudhuri, and in which he mentioned Chowringhee and didn't say Chowringhee, comma, Calcutta's principal shopping street, comma, or whatever Chowringhee was. And he resisted any change to that, and he was quite right to do so, I think. And I came across it again in Arundhati Roy's piece, in which the initials PWD were mentioned without any kind of explanation of Public Works Department. And of course, once you translate PWD into Public Works Department, it seems terribly formal and kind of unpersuasive and un-Indian. So in the end, things like that are being left alone in publishing, not all the time, in London and New York. And I think that's just a sign of a sign of kind of confidence from here as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think
That
that,
they're not going to change.
yeah.
You're not going to change things.
yeah, I mean, certainly as a publisher, I find that there is a confidence and among writers that they don't feel they have to explain themselves and explain India to the readers. But do we have, is it time to open it up to questions? Okay, I want to just give me 1 second. I want you people to think of one other thing, but we probably don't have time to go into it, but maybe in the questions if you are, whether you think there have been any changes in the publishing environment that have also offered to writers like you the possibility of writing more and bringing in more variety into writing. I mean, as a publisher, I can say that 20 years ago, the Indian publishing environment was dominated by textbooks for school and the university sector. And it's a received truth in publishing that 80 to 85% of the publishing was textbook publishing. General publishing, writing for the general reader, was a space that really wasn't inhabited very much. And it's beginning to change now. That is seen as one of the fastest growing sectors of publishing. So, because writers can't really write in a vacuum. There also has to be a hospitable environment of readers and publishers who take their works to attention.
Well, I think that one factor is that the obvious good health or relative good health of the print and journalism industry in India vis-a-vis the rest of the world, where it increasingly feels like a funeral wake, means that the best international publications are having to invest in certain ways, not just in commissioning work from India, but in building a potential market for their product back in India. And you've seen several you've seen the New York Times has experimented with this, the Wall Street Journal has done it, the Guardian is maybe sort of exploring this question right now. India might have to play a part in supporting these publications that have otherwise been, it's been entirely at the discretion to ignore it or to engage with India. That's just meant that that it is much easier. There are many more opportunities now, and there's much more interaction between the best publications in the world and Indian writers who might be based in Bangalore. And so I think that interaction, the opportunity, the knowledge that such opportunities do exist, if you can nail it, is helping people raise their game. Yeah.
Okay, great. On that note, let's open it up. The lady who's got her hand up over there. And I think what we might do, the mic is coming to you. We might take 3 questions from this side, have the panelists respond, and then 3 more from this side. So short, please.
Sure. So one more thing I think which is a underlying leitmotif, I'm from Delhi, so I have the press in my genes. I think one of the points you made, which I want to really laud here, is the foreign correspondent. And do you think there is some kind of, like I said, leitmotif that we have not had a Hemingway or a Garbo or a William Shirer who went abroad and their, Weltanschauung, worldview changed because of the nature of their journalistic experience. And they brought this political worldview into everything they wrote, especially Garcia Marquez, I think everything he's ever written has a political undercurrent. And we only have right now people like Basharat Peer and even Raghu, who's written about Manipur and, but we haven't had a politically subtarred novel, even if it's about Kashmir and Punjab.
Okay, so
what's the cause?
There's a gentleman ahead of you, please. Yeah, I'll come to you.
Yeah, hi. This is specifically for Raghu. I mean, when you talk about how there are a lot of these international papers that are more and more interested in Indian writing, so I want to know from you, is there still a pressure of kind of conforming to the, the worldview that the Western world would have of India? Like, when you are writing for them, is there a sort of a pressure to kind of paint it in a particular way, if you know what I'm saying? I mean, so for example, for a long time you had this thing wherein you were supposed to, show the poverty and things like that. But now, I mean, is there that kind of a thing happening vis-a-vis international public?
Can you pass it to the person in front? Yeah.
My question is totally off the mark. There were, in Sam's book, A Strange Kind of Paradise, there were many sexual references in the ancient chroniclers' account like Ibn Battuta and Herodotus. So what happened now? Why has sex become such a taboo in modern age?
Okay, got three
And we can hardly talk
All right.
about it.
Okay, can you give the mic back? Anyone wants to respond to those questions?
I can respond to the first.
Yeah?
It's a striking thing that India produces really good writers, but they tend to write only about India. I'm longing for somebody from this country to go to Britain and write about Britain in a way that's kind of eye-opening to me as somebody who lives there. It's not impossible, it can be done. And yet, very few Indian journalists, when they're in Britain, even bother to stir out of London. And there's some kind of lack of money, perhaps, that's important. But there's something kind of more fundamental, which is a kind of confidence and a curiosity to find out about things outside this country. So I long for those people.
Anyone else before I move on to Raghu?
Should I address this question about?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I think that to start off, it's important to remember that we have plenty of biases in terms of how we write for ourselves within India, and those might be the more sensitive ones or the more costly ones. In fact, it's easier. It's actually much easier. You can still see plenty of prejudices in terms of what foreign editors might want to be commissioning. I don't actually write a whole lot for the international press, so I don't want to make it seem like that. The BBC has a slightly bad reputation for its affection for stories of 16-year-olds being married to goats or trees or bats or whatever can be dug out from. You can defend yourself, but I think that's just BBC Online. It still happens. It's not going to go away, and it isn't something that's particular to the relationship of international newspapers to India, though sometimes it becomes more visible.
Yes, ma'am. Please.
I wanted to answer, sorry.
Oh, you wanted to answer that?
No,
Yes.
in a roundabout way. I can't answer your question, which was about sexuality in India and why it's not talked about. Just one thing I wanted to point out, and it again relates to the essay I've done in here, is that Gandhi talked about sexuality in a very open way. And that part of all his writing has slightly been forgotten. And I think if people want to encourage a debate, that might be one way to frame it, because it's absolutely clear and open and detailed in lots of his writings, both in his unpublished memoirs, unpublished writings, and in stuff that you can buy at any bookstall. It's all there.
And it's not actually, if I may just jump in, you've heard of the writer Perumal Murugan, who's had to step down from writing, and one of the issues was sexuality in his writing. Can we pass the mic here to this lady in front?
Thank you. So you said that a lot of Indian authors are moving towards non-fiction now. So what do you think is the future of Indian fiction writing?
Okay, there was somebody at the back with dark glasses. That lady was raising her hand, yeah.
I would love it if we could get a sense of the kind of pieces that were rejected, that didn't make the cut in the anthology. Thank you.
Okay, and then there was that gentleman right at the back with, the one who's standing up.
It's interesting to note actually that most of the stories in India rotate around the rural places, or let's say the suburbs around the city. For example, Deepti had also said that she went with her driver to his village and asked him about stories and experiences. So moving forward, do we see bucking the trend, and if not, why?
Okay, I don't know how you got the mic. It was supposed to go there, but it's great. Over there. We take 4 questions now, just to be fair.
Yeah, basically I wanted to ask that Raghu Karnad mentioned that magazines need to invest more, not just in commissioning, but also in something else. I have forgotten what he was saying.
In
but
building
when
a
he was,
leadership here,
yeah, but I did wonder at the moment when he said need to invest more in more than commissioning, I was also thinking about different fonts and scripts that are used. Because a lot of writing which is not done, hasn't been done until now, should be done, is that how to write in, how to transliterate different languages in different scripts, and how to format that in magazines I at least do it on my blogs, because some of the blogs allow for that to happen. But, so for instance, I translated Raja Harishchandra into King Moonbloom. But because, and then Nosferatu, a German film, a silent German film, into Contagious. So
what's the question?
the question is how would magazines go about removing the cultural, closing the gap between cultural distances, that when we try to investigate into the obscenities that are spouted in Britain, for instance, and the obscenities that are spouted in South Asia.
Can you ask the question,
please?
please?
Yeah, because you're taking too long. If you have a question, okay. All right. The quick responses, then we'll take one more round of questions if
Okay,
we have time.
my quick
Do we have time?
response to the question.
It's over? Okay, so quick responses and then it's over. Okay.
Okay, so did you have a piece that was rejected, the questioner? If you had, we rejected, sadly, very good pieces. If it wasn't your piece that was rejected, we rejected stuff we didn't like very much. That seems to be the best answer I can come up with.
An honest answer. Responses to any of the questions?
I can't remember them now.
Can't remember the question.
New directions in fiction maybe could be.
I think, you know, the traditional storytelling that fiction, you know, used to do, the family sagas, the big stories, I think non-fiction can do better. Fiction has to be much more innovative in style and structure, much more non-conventional now if it has to, I mean, do something else. I think even, for example, television shows do it so well. I mean, you know, long form like The Wire, Breaking Bad, they've also taken over that kind of the big story, that big Dickensian world that they portray. That's being done really well by TV. So fiction has to go in new directions. So that's what I feel.
And I think in fiction, maybe you want to also think differently of the novel and the short story and other forms of fiction. I mean, one of the things that you've said is that in the earlier issue of Granta in 1997, you didn't even look at poetry, and now you have poetry. So that is another of the changes, which we didn't actually talk about. But
just very quickly, we had a poem in the first Granta India by Vikram Seth.
By Vikram Seth,
And
yes.
unfortunately, we had a little note at the end of the poem, which we hadn't told him about, explaining the subject of the poem, which was a Hindu god. And he complained so vociferously and so long and so loudly that we had to reprint the poem again without the note in the succeeding issue. So over my dead body, I didn't want to print more poetry, but I've had to print more poetry.
You had to print it. Okay, on that note, thank you all very much. Deepti, Ian, Sam, Raghu, thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deepti Kapoor, Raghu Karnad, Sam Miller, Urvashi Butalia, and Ian. Thank you so much for this informative session. The next here will be a book launch. Not a book launch, actually. The book is going to be published in February. I'll just give you the details in a minute. But stay here, and we'll be presenting